Hello, everybody. My name is Curtis Wright, and I'm the president of the Chicago Map Society. Because it was cut off in our original recording, I just wanted to give everyone a brief introduction to the following presentation, which originally took place at our monthly meeting on May 27th, 2021. It features Dr. Asa Mittman presenting some of his latest research on the imagery used to depict Jews on medieval Christian maps. Dr. Mittman is a professor in the Department of Art and Art History at California State University, Chico. A former New Yorker, Dr. Mittman received his Ph.D. in art history from Stanford University and has written a number of books and articles on monsters, art, and film about the vaguely defined period known as the Middle Ages. Some of his recent works include a book titled Maps and Monsters in Medieval England and co-editing the Ashgate Research Companion to Monsters and the Monstrous. He also serves as a director of the Virtual Mappa Project, an online resource dedicated to the research of early medieval maps and geographical texts. It was a delight to host him, and I hope you enjoy his engaging presentation as much as we did.
Share my recording in progress. I'm just going to share my screen here. And let's see, there we go. We are, have you got that? Are we screen sharing successfully and ready to roll?
Looks great from this end.
Perfect. All right. Well, then, without further ado, I'll jump right in. So, far from Jerusalem. I've decided today to begin with something I've only really just started working on. And so I hope this works. After a brief introduction to medieval maps, the next section of this paper is material I've been writing just in the last couple of weeks. And it is my bold hope that it will help establish a change in the framing, not only of my work on medieval maps, but actually on the field as a whole. To do this requires a bit of historiographical work. That is a study of how the modern field of the history of cartography has constructed its categories. But first, since this is a talk about medieval maps and the way the modern discipline of the history of cartography is structured around them, and about how both the source materials and modern studies of them construct a rarely voiced form of race, a bit of background. The discipline of cartography proper did not exist as a separate field of endeavor, as far as we can tell, in the Middle Ages. Map makers were frequently involved in other forms of image and text production. Matthew Paris, for example, the 13th century polymath Benedictine monk of St. Albans, was one of the more prolific medieval map makers, and his works include 2 world maps and 1 map of Palestine, as well as 3 maps of the so-called Holy Land, 4 maps of Britain, and 4 sets of itinerary maps linking the two together. He also, though, generated chronicles, histories, genealogies, saints' lives, zoological images, and fortune-telling devices, evincing interests in heraldry, anthropology, and astrology, among any number of other things. Mapmaking, then, was not the exclusive and separate province of a professional class of cartographers, but rather part of the larger intellectual and religious project of the scholarly monastic community of medieval Europe. This liberates medieval maps from wrong-headed critiques exemplified by Charles Beasley, who famously or infamously wrote in 1906, quote, "The non-scientific maps of the later Middle Ages are of such complete futility that a bare allusion to the monstrosities of Hereford and Ebsdorf should suffice." This teleological view of the progression of the so-called science of cartography posits the Middle Ages as a faltering step toward what Beasley called the dawn of modern geography. That's the title of his book. Medieval mapmaking was instead a bold, powerful, and highly effective practice aimed at constructing arguments about geography, history, spirituality, eschatology, nationality, zoology, monstrosity, humanity, and on. Turning to medieval Christian mappamundi, or maps of the world, among the dominant forms in this period was the TO model, commonly found serving as a sort of frontispiece to the geographical content of Isidore of Seville's popular Etymologies, a text seeking to explain God's divine plan via the origins of Latin words. TO maps were the most common Christian map type of the Middle Ages and continued to be used long after geographically accurate models were adopted, indicating that this is not a failed version of such maps, nor a nascent stage in the development of supposedly better forms of cartography, but rather a useful schematic image for conveying the layout of the world from a Christian perspective. Hundreds survive in comparison to the dozen or so of the more detailed types. TO maps are deceptively simple. These diagrammatic maps are actually jam-packed with perspectives and ideologies. As John Block Friedman writes, all medieval maps should be seen as expressions of contemporary cosmology and theology, rather than objects of utility. The TO format is based on the division of the world into 3 parts, one for each of Noah's sons, as shown on this modified TO map. Such maps, functioning like all maps, convey their content through spatial organization. The T of the TO is formed by 3 bodies of water. The vertical line represents the Mediterranean, the right branch of the horizontal line represents the Tanais, which is the River Don, and the left branch is the Nile. The Hereford map, where I will be focusing some of my time today, might well be seen as a sort of elaborate TO map, admittedly with the lines of the T somewhat bent and the edges crinkly. Like the TO map, it presents Asia at the top. It is oriented toward the Orient, with Europe in the lower left and Africa to the lower right. Indeed, some TO maps are more closely aligned with Hereford, such as a 12th century example emphasizing the bifurcation of the Red Sea that you can see in the upper right there, and the Nile's division of Africa from Asia. The Ebsdorf map emphasizes the T of the TO as the cross, suggesting that the Christian message is truly ecumenical. That is, it applies to the entire ecumene, or inhabitable world, as depicted on all of these Mappa Mundi world maps. From another perspective, though, this ecumenical message is utterly colonialist. If the message can spread everywhere, the message, thus runs the logic of these maps, should spread everywhere. While it's easy to dismiss the TO maps as absurd, they in no way convey to us the world as we know it, we should pause before doing so. Beneath their surface, they are no different from any other mapping forms. As cartographic theorist Dennis Woods reminds us, there is nothing natural about any map. It is a cultural artifact, an accumulation of choices made among choices, every one of which reveals a value, not the world, but a slice of a piece of the world, not nature, but a slant on it, not innocent, but loaded with intentions and purposes, not directly, but through a glass, not straight, but mediated by words and other signs, not in a word, as it is. The history of medieval cartography is likewise not, in a word, as it is. In what follows, I've been inspired by Geraldine Hang's recent groundbreaking field-changing study of the invention of race in the European Middle Ages, where she argues not only that race is a term and a concept appropriate to apply in writing about the Middle Ages, but also that we can subdivide race into several key categories that challenge modern definitions primarily rooted in fantasies of so-called color. In so doing, Hang proposes that in addition to considering constructs of epidermal race, as she calls it, which is what modern people tend to fixate on, that we should examine religious race, colonial race, and also what she calls cartographic race. Hang gestures very briefly toward this concept, relying on the Hereford map as the paradigm of the most spectacular cultural creations of the medieval period, the Mappa Mundi or world map, as she says. Here, I attempt to extend the work that she began to consider what cartographic race might be, how it is constructed, what races are generated on medieval Christian maps, and of course, what all this has to do with medieval Christian perceptions of Jews. In order to do so, I first consider the terminology that modern historians of cartography have applied to the maps of the period, and then look at the maps themselves, as both the medieval map makers and modern scholars who study them are, I contend, consciously or otherwise, actively engaged in race making. I have thus far deliberately deployed the term Christian, where most historians of cartography have used European, or simply medieval. For example, in the University of Chicago's celebrated 6-volume History of Cartography series, PDA Harvey's Medieval Maps: An Introduction opens with a statement that few maps were drawn in medieval Europe. There are no mentions in this chapter, which I've used many times in university courses to introduce students to the field, of Jews or Muslims. But perhaps more significantly, there are also no mentions of Christians, who remain the unspoken assumed normate, the unvoiced subject of the chapter, as it is likewise the unvoiced subject of the field. The operative category for Harvey's introduction, as for most works in the field, is something more like medieval Latin Christian maps from Western Europe. since the claims made throughout this chapter on, quote, medieval maps are really only applicable to those produced by and for Western Latin Christians and primarily housed and hung and used in unambiguously religious contexts, cathedral, convent, and monastery walls, devotional manuscripts, and the like, though there are other indications that some were in royal palace contexts as well. Harvey has a single dismissive mention of what he frames as Arab cartography and an even more indifferent reference to the cartography of China, where he says, nor, of course, did classical antiquity provide the only possible external influence on medieval mapping. There may have been some connections with Arab cartography, though this is harder to maintain now than it once was, and the possibility of even remoter links with the cartography of China cannot be entirely ruled out. Harvey's framing again removes religion from the discussion as he describes these maps, which he argues were not likely influential on so-called European maps anyway, as Arab rather than Islamic, as they're much more often called. Of course, since Spain is part of any modern definition of Europe, there were certainly maps made in the Middle Ages that are both quote unquote Arab and quote unquote European. Indeed, Al-Andalus, the Arabic name for Islamic territories in medieval Spain, was so integrated into the larger Muslim world that separating Europe from Arab is untenable. Here, for example, is a map of the world featuring a lovely image of Iberia based on the work of Al-Idrisi, a descendant of a family from Malaga, Spain, born in Morocco and educated in Cordoba. The claim that there were no connections between these two overlapping categories is nonsensical, but then the point, conscious or otherwise, is to define Europe as Christian, and anything non-Christian as, in Harvey's term, external. He might as well simply say other and be done with it. All the maps Harvey mentions by maker or conventional name are Christian maps. Ebsdorf, Goff, Pietro Visconti's maps, and Nicholas of Cusha's maps. Harvey does mention Portolan charts a few times, but does not note that one of the most famous Portolan-like maps, the late 14th century Catalan atlas, was produced by Abraham and Yehuda Kreskis, who were Jews from Majorca. Christian maps produced in the Kingdom of Jerusalem would fit with Harvey's claims, but Byzantine cartography is granted a separate chapter in the volume, housed, despite the empire's endurance up to 1453, in the section on cartography in ancient Europe and the Mediterranean, as opposed to cartography on medieval Europe and the Mediterranean, relegating the Byzantine East to some sort of pastness, as if it were an antecedent to the European Middle Ages, as it is often positioned in art historical survey texts and courses as well. It seems, therefore, that medieval Europe's cartography is really here, again, the cartography of medieval Latin Christians, more or less wherever they are. The category is religious, cultural, and linguistic, not geographical. And this is all the more striking in the work of historians of cartography, who are surely highly attuned to the geography of their sources. The framing here is likely a consequence of unthinking adherence to modern categorization, rather than some sort of willful desire to exclude. But it's not just thus. It never is. Continents were not, in the Middle Ages, a meaningful category. And when geographers adopted them, they did so not by following a neutral assessment of plate tectonics or anything like that, but out of the prior operative categories. In other words, Europe was created out of the remains of Christendom. Recent work in the history of geography, which really should have more of an influence on the history of cartography than it thus far has, establishes important groundwork here. Valerie Kivelson writes, like any human construct, Europe had to be imagined into being. Europe is not a fact, a given. It's not even a naturally delimited geographic entity. Daniel Folliard agrees, stressing that the divisions of the globe are evolving constructs. Continents are not natural, pre-existing features of the world awaiting discovery. They're cultural impositions on the natural landforms of the planet. Scholars have argued that only Latin Christians saw the division of the world into major parts as a natural feature of the world, and that their view is actually what influenced modern European geographers. In this way, Christendom, which was never a continent properly speaking, came to be the unspoken underpinnings of the continent of Europe. But there's more. The earliest identified use of the predecessor terms comes from ancient Greece in Aeschylus's The Persians, where the world is divided into only two parts, two proto-continents, if you will, that of the Greeks and that of their age-old cultural rivals, Persians. This is significant because this early version of the division of the world into the Greek-Persian binary that eventually became the West-East binary shows that these divisions are divisions. That is, they're not neutral geographical notions, but part of the us-them construct out of which the Greek identity was constructed, and out of which so many other identities have been since. These named areas are elements of what Martin Lewis and Karen Wigan call meta-geography, which is the set of spatial structures through which people order their knowledge of the world, the often unconscious frameworks that organize studies of history, sociology, anthropology, economics, political science, and even natural history. Christendom was never a continent, never a nation state, but it was a supracontinental block of the sort encompassed by modern terms like the West. These terms and their origins matter because they carry with them significant baggage. Conflating continents with races, influential 19th century German geographer Karl Ritter viewed Europe as the land of white people, Africa as that of black people, Asia of yellow people, and America of red people. A pernicious notion that still lingers very much in the public imagination. It was thus with Christendom as well, though here we would replace white with Christian, which in the Middle Ages was arguably the more prominent racial category. As Lewis and Wigan put it, the original and persistent core of the West has always been Latin Christendom. The name has changed, but the exclusionary implications persist, such that while Christendom was open and clear in its direction that it was the land of Christians, Europe has in many ways, and especially in medieval studies, remained so, while concealing this segregatory structure behind what appears to be more neutral, non-racialized terms. We can track the use of the terms I've highlighted in Harvey's chapter backward and forward in the history of cartography. It's omnipresent. Indeed, David Woodward opens the opens the very next chapter in the same volume, which bears a similarly broad and encompassing title of Medieval Mappa Mundi by clarifying his singularly Christian focus. Quote, in the millennium that links the ancient and modern worlds from about the 5th through the 15th century, there developed a genre of world maps or map paintings originating in the classical tradition, but adopted by the Christian church. The primary purpose of these Mappa Mundi, as they were called, was to instruct the faithful about the significant events in Christian history rather than to record their precise locations. Woodward considers Jewish events of relevance here only for the integral role so-called Old Testament events, in Old Testament being an explicitly Christian appropriation of Jewish scripture, played, quote, for the Christian. All but one of the maps described and illustrated by Woodward are Christian maps. The singular exception is again that Kreski's Catalan Atlas, but like Harvey, Woodward makes no mention of the religion of its creators. They are characterized only as Catalan cartographers, and their Jewishness is thereby effaced in the narrative. Indeed, not only is this chapter on medieval maps about Christian maps, but the basic frame of reference is explicitly and archaically Christian. He writes, from about the 5th to the 15th century after Christ. But these approaches to the history of Western medieval cartography were not new in the 1980s when J.B. Harvey and David Woodward were editing the History of Cartography series. Indeed, the sources Harley cites as the most important early studies on the history of medieval maps generally conform to this convention. For example, Marcel Destom's 1964 Mappa Mundus presents a remarkable 1,100 manuscript maps which were found in 900 manuscripts, but 740 of them are Latin, and the others are all French and Italian. Likewise, the paragraph-length title of the famous volume by the grandly named Manuel Francisco de Barros de Sousa de Mesquita de Macedo, the second Viscount of Santarem, occludes its actual subject. Again, a historian of cartography defines the subject as les cartographies pendant le Moyen Âge, but confines his discussion to medieval Christian maps. Similarly, Conrad Miller's foundational 6-volume series from the 1890s, Mappa Mundi, the oldest world maps, refers to medieval world maps, medieval maps, geography, and description of the world throughout. Across more than 600 pages, Miller has a single reference to the Christian Middle Ages. Unsurprisingly, he uses medieval Christian terminology, only recently re-examined by historians, to refer to Muslims in writing of the production of Spanish Christian Beatus maps, saying that at that time the mountains of Asturias were places of refuge for Christian refugees from the Saracens, as Shakufa Rajab Zeda powerfully argues. The label Saracen is a racist reference to Muslims, and it is Islamophobia at work in its most genius and powerful form. Every time the label is pronounced, she writes, Muslims are presumed guilty of fabricated genealogy, of co-opting Christian history, and of misrepresenting themselves and their faith, of manipulating those around them. In addition to this perhaps routine terminological Islamophobia, ubiquitous in medieval studies even today, Miller seems to go out of his way to add in a bit of anti-Semitism. For his transcription of a passage on the so-called Oxford Outremer map from Oxford Corpus Christi College, reading Ubi crux Nicodeme, here is the cross of Nicodemus, he provides the following gloss. There's the text. Now he says, this probably relates to the miraculous image of Christ, who was pinned or tacked to the cross by Jews. Miller's transcription of the brief text of the map is straightforward, but the gloss is not. The German is perhaps ambiguous here, as the relative pronoun welches can carry with it the sense of both who or which. And so Miller might be saying that the Jews nailed the image of Christ to the cross, though this wouldn't suit the myth that he's characterizing. The singular Jew of this anti-Semitic legend, quote, pierced the cross, not the image of Christ on it, whereas Miller has the plural Juden. In addition, his somewhat unexpected term is geheft, pinned to, stitched to, clipped to, etc., which does not suit the narrative of piercing the cross. A more straightforward, though also more troubling conclusion is that Miller is taking time and space to add into this entry the pernicious allegation, which Miller certainly knew did not accord with the gospel accounts, that quote unquote, the Jews nailed Christ himself to the cross. The repeated conflation of territory and religion presents as fundamentally cohesive the entirely disunified and fractious polities from the far west, Connacht and Munster, Iceland, Ultima Thule, to some point east, the Holy Roman Empire, the Black Sea, the Caucasus Mountains, the Caspian Sea, the enclosure of Gog and Magog, from southern Scandinavia, Oslo, Denmark, Jutland, Jotunheim, to some point south, the Kingdom of Naples or Castile or maybe Sicily, the Kingdom of Jerusalem before its founding and after its fall. It revivifies under a new name the old, vague, ever-shifting Christendom, a non-state founded upon and designed to further the exclusion of non-Christian populations, as well as Christians belonging to non-majority sects. These works of cartographic history then participate in an almost 2 millennia long effort of demanding that more and more territory be reserved for the exclusive inhabitation of Christians, and the concomitant declaration that all outside of the purported, unclear, ever-expanding borders are either pre-Christian, awaiting eventual assimilation, or forever non-Christian, and thereby forever anathema, providing through their very existence the necessary point of contrast by which Christians have defined themselves since the very earliest Christian writings from Paul forward. The reason that there are no clear borders to Christendom is that it is not, was not, has never been at any point an actual polity. It has never had a ruler, a government, or a system of laws, and has therefore also never had boundaries. It is an entity that overlaps and is imbricated with actual kingdoms, duchies, principalities, republics, colonies, and empires. It is not therefore a political category at all, but rather, following Geraldine Heng's definition, a racial one. Christendom is, and here I quote her, a structural relationship for the articulation and management of human differences, rather than a substantive content. And this short historiographical survey of the history of cartography demonstrates the continuity of that racialization of the European Middle Ages. Equivalent work could, of course, be performed in other areas of medieval studies, as the elisions described here are ubiquitous in art history, literary studies, and on. This sleight of hand is happening in the use of the terms medieval, Middle Ages, and European, of Mittelalterlichen, Le Moyen Âge, and on. Following Michel Foucault's work on discourses, my Chico State colleague Michael Coyle articulates this phenomenon well. He says, language then fabricates, not because words are false or because they lie, but because their habitual everyday use is a mostly unregistered act of creation. The work of these authors, and that of others across multiple fields of study, demonstrate that the use of language in social life can privilege certain discourses while marginalizing alternative discourses to subordinate positions or even to irrelevancy. In this case, it is a Christian discourse that is elevated and a Christian normate that is generated in the unregistered acts of creation throughout the field from its inception to the present. And it is the existence of Jews, of Muslims, of polytheists, of minority Christian sects that are marginalized into irrelevancy, indeed into apparent non-existence. And so this brings me back to medieval maps and the presence of Jews thereon. And of course, I should note, one could produce a parallel study to what I've been working on images of Muslims on medieval Christian maps, which would prove equally fruitful, I'm sure. Informally, I've described the larger project from which this talk comes as a book about Jews on medieval Christian maps. It was this framing that got me thinking about the way that we as a discipline obscure the Christianness of the maps. The maps I discuss are by, for, and about Christians. That Jews appear on them at all, and they do so prominently and consistently, indicates that the map makers believe that Jews served an important role in the process of defining Christendom as a region and Christians as a race, since the race being constructed on these maps is not actually Jews, but Christians. The raciality of Jews was, in essence, a given in the era of the expulsion of the Jews from England, when many of these maps were made in the general ballpark. And it has remained so in all the centuries since then. They are but one of the many racialized peoples on medieval Christian Mappa Mundi. It's always worth reasserting the fact that the delightful monstrous peoples that attract so much attention on the edges of the maps were intended as representations of the actual populations of Africa and Asia. Well, it's great fun to contemplate these beings. They're a sort of trap in that the extremity of the fantasy involved in their creation is absolute, so it's difficult to associate them with the populations they overwrite. That is to say, headless people, one-footed people, and so on, do not to us in any way recall the actual populations of these regions. With the map's images of Jews, though, such as this depiction of the worship of the golden calf, the connection cannot be lost. They are called by the same name. That inscription, the rubric there says Judei, that is Jews, and are represented with some of the very same physiognomic and dispositional stereotypes that still function in anti-Semitic rhetoric today. That we have as a field mostly managed to ignore their presence is a testament to the power of the discourse of the history of cartography to consign positions not rooted in Christian supremacy, even to irrelevancy. The Hereford map, where I'll spend much of the rest of this talk, is something of an icon in the world of medieval cartography, a superstar for perfectly understandable reasons. It's larger and more complex than any other known surviving map of the Middle Ages. It's a massive encyclopedic sheet, 5 feet tall and containing 1,091 inscriptions distributed throughout its extent. It has been seen as a terrestrial map, a universal map, a biblical compendium, a history, say Historie, as it was called by its putative maker, Richard of Holdingham or Sleaford, now considered more likely to have designed an earlier version. It is also an argument or a collection of interlocking arguments about the nature of England and of Christians and of Christianity, about the differences among European groups, between Europeans and the peoples of Asia and Africa, about Jesus and Mary, heaven and hell, Jerusalem, the flow of history, the ages of man, spectatorship, the necessity of the crusades, the conquest of Ireland, the saintliness of a local bishop, and the universal nature of salvation, to name just a few credible arguments that have been put forth by other scholars about it. The map was produced in England around 1305, a potent moment in English history, especially as regards its interactions with the Holy Land abroad and Jews back home. The dating is based on dendrochronology, the tree rings of the oak panel it was made and displayed on, the toponyms it contains, paleographical and art historical assessments, and possible connections to the renovations to the cathedral to glorify Bishop Thomas Cantilupe, an inveterate enemy to the Jews, as another scholar has called him, who died in 1283. It was probably produced for and at the cathedral in Hereford, where it has been more or less for the 700 years since. It seems likely to have been originally located in the South Choir Aisle as part of a processional route toward the bishop's tomb. The inner circle of the map represents the ecumene, the inhabitable world, ringed round by the green band of ocean. To be clear, this is a two-dimensional representation of what was known to be a three-dimensional spherical Earth, the far side of which was believed to contain only ocean. The TO organization is complemented by a radial organization. The Hereford, Ebsdorf, and Salter maps, I'll show you the others in a minute, are all emphatically centered on Jerusalem, considered to be the literal as well as spiritual center of the world, following the ideas of St. Jerome and others. On Hereford, Jerusalem is represented as a circular city fringed with crenellations and marked at regular intervals with closed and barred doors. Like the sprockets of a gear, these crenellations radiate outward, pointing us away from and back in toward the center, marking the center of the world as sacred, reflecting God's design. There are many thems throughout the medieval maps. The most often commented upon are those so-called monstrous races or Plinian races concentrated along the southern edge of several of these maps. Derived from the works of Herodotus, Pliny, Isidore of Seville, and others, these monstrous peoples are often human-animal hybrids or humans defined by excess or lack, too many eyes, too few legs, and so on. The Salter map has a good set locked into little blue and orange boxes. Working from west to east, that is from bottom to top, we seem to encounter the following. An anthropophagic cynocephalus, that's a person-eating dog-headed person, an anthropophagus or cannibal, the crawling Himantopodes, animal-riding, cave-dwelling, lizard-eating troglodytes, epiphagi, who have their eyes on their shoulders, blemmies, who have their eyes on their chests, the large-lipped Amyctrichii, the single-footed sciopod, the Mauritani Ethiopes, who have 4 eyes and see into great distance, the Salmyrae, whose children are immune to snake venom, the people who speak only using gestures, the straw drinkers, and the Arabatatis, who walk stooped over, and finally, the wonderful people without noses. Hereford has a similar set in the same position. While these monstrous people are central to the project of medieval identity formation through dependent differentiation, that is, definition by means of difference, a smaller detail is as potent. Not far from the east end of the run of the monstrous peoples on the Hereford map, quite similar to those on the Salter map. In the southeast quadrant of the world, in Arabia, between the 2 arms of the Red Sea, we find the Jews, a mass of 4 men in vaguely monastic robes, kneeling in prayer before an altar on which squats Mahoun, an ugly, twisting calf that, despite the use of gold throughout the map, is decidedly not golden. The calf idol is raising its hind leg to defecate on the altar. Here we're reminded of the centrality of Jews to Christian ideas about history, as well as the centrality of the sacred spaces of the Holy Land, like Mount Sinai, to the narrative. This scene should present the golden calf of Exodus following the pattern of images around it, including Moses receiving the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai just above, and the dark, blurred trail marking the wandering of the Israelites. However, the idol is clearly labeled Mahoun. This is an anti-Islamic term for an idol purportedly worshipped by Muslims. In contrast, the image depicts Jews labeled Judei, and the one figure whose face can be seen is shown in this standard caricature in full profile to highlight the large hooked nose and beard. Beneath the squatting calf is a series of roundels bearing the motif of the cross. Given the small scale of the image, the whole vignette is only about 2.5 inches high. And the loose style, it's unclear what these represent. Maybe a decorative motif, maybe a decorated altar cloth. There does seem to be a cloth hanging over a stone structure with a curving lower hem. There are similar panels on other altars on the map, but none with crosses. Perhaps most potently, these round discs bearing the imprint of the cross upon them may be the wafers of the Eucharist, placed carefully atop the altar upon which the idol, and by implication its idolaters, defecate. The idol would be defecating not merely on the altar of Christ, but according to the dogma of transubstantiation affirmed by the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, on the body of Christ itself. This mirrors medieval accusations of host desecration and other entirely fictional acts of defamation, suggesting that in the medieval present, Jews carried ceaselessly on, humiliating and killing Christ through ritual reenactments of the crucifixion. It is my contention that this image on the Hereford map is a powerful condensation of English notions of otherness, especially as crystallized in the late 13th century. It conflates Jews, Muslims, and polytheists, idols and demons, the present Holy Land, and the biblical past, time, territory, and teratology. This image then contains considerable material against which the intended audience, English Christians, might define themselves. These figures are utterly fictionalized in ways that are very much in keeping with larger medieval Christian discourses of anti-Semitism. The Hereford map was made in the wake of the expulsion, perhaps 10 or 15 years after all Jews were bodily forced from England in 1290. Again, this might have been the end of the story. An abused and disempowered group targeted by racist rhetoric is segregated, bankrupted, dispossessed, and ultimately forced out of the region altogether. Still, after the Jewries were attacked and their occupants were forced to convert, were murdered, or were expelled from homes that they had, in some cases, held for over 200 years, Jews remained a strong presence in the Christian imaginary. As Mary Krumel writes, expulsion presumably removes otherness from the territory and replaces it with otherness elsewhere. But memory of that other nation, that Jewish nation, continues to haunt the English imaginary, even when the number of physically present Jews, of visiting Jews, did not add up to a quorum. Where the Jews had been metaphorically walled into their legally mandated ghettos and small territories prescribed by kings whose property they literally were, once expelled, they came to be walled up with greater force. If the problem of the Jewish presence in England was not really difference, but sameness, not a complete and unbreachable schism, but a too close relationship, as some authors have argued, then what was needed after the expulsion was not forgetfulness. Part of the project of self-definition was a bigger wall. As Anthony Bale analyzes Matthew Paris, to whom I'll turn shortly, it was not difference that made Jews threatening to medieval Englishmen, but rather the Jews' possible interaction and familiarity with the structures and images of medieval England that caused concern. On the one hand, we read in Christian sources of and see in Christian imagery the hideous Jew, the subhuman Jew, the hook-nosed, bug-eyed, horned Jew, the foul-smelling Jew, the monstrous Jew, obviously different from, inferior to his Christian neighbors. On the other hand, we read of the need for very large, bright yellow badges, legally mandated to mark Jews off as different. The hermeneutic Jew, the imagined Jew of Christian rhetoric, was immediately identifiable. Real flesh and blood Jews, though, needed to be rendered visible. Krumel argues that badges facilitated the construction of what she calls a visual panopticon in order to map the Jew, the stranger in Christendom. But of course, map makers also mapped Jews. We see them in the image of the golden calf, but also at the northern edge of the ecumene, locked up behind a different wall. The Jews were, before and after expulsion, not only entombed within Jewries mandated by English kings, but also behind the Caspian Wall and its great gate, built by that paragon of kingship, Alexander the Great. So, the cold land of Bizo. There are many natural boundaries on the Hereford map: mountains, walls, rivers, seas, and ultimately the great green ocean that wraps around the Pangaea-like Afro-Eurasian landmass that occupies 3/4 of this single great sheet of vellum. Some of these boundaries are fluid and organic, like the branching rivers of Europe and the wave-like undulations of the North African coastline. Others are rectilinear and rigid. There is, though, only one single freestanding masonry wall indicated on the Hereford map, and it is one fraught with great significance. Tucked away in the northeast corner of this circular representation of the spherical world, it cordons off a large peninsula, doubly encircled on its 3 sides by mountains and then water. A lengthy inscription is crammed into the space within that reads, "Here are all kinds of horrors, more than can be imagined, intolerable cold, a constant blasting wind from the mountains, which the inhabitants call Bizo. Here are exceedingly savage people who eat human flesh and drink blood, the accursed sons of Cain. The Lord used Alexander the Great to close them off, for within sight of the king an earthquake occurred and mountains tumbled upon mountains all around them. Where there were no mountains, Alexander hemmed them in with an indestructible wall." These accursed sons of Cain are the peoples of Gog and Magog. Their hard land of inconceivable horrors is at once geographically remote and, I would argue, exegetically, hermeneutically, and eschatologically central to the mapmaker's community and the larger project of establishing and maintaining that central fiction of medieval Europe, Christendom. Given the great importance of the Wall of Gog and Magog, we should not be surprised to find that it's also represented prominently on several other medieval maps, including the Sawley map, considered the closest to Hereford content, but also ranging from the tiny gem-like Psalter map produced around 1265, possibly for a royal patron and only a few inches across its diameter, to the massive Ebsdorf map produced for the monastery in Ebsdorf, Germany, stretching approximately 12 feet in diameter and destroyed in the Allied bombing of Hanover in 1943, shown here to scale with the Salter map. So you can see how dramatic the size differences are with these objects. And also on all three of Matthew Paris's maps of the Holy Land, all mid-13th century from St. Albans, England, and I'll come in a moment. Again and again, the wall was vital to the project of medieval world map design. And we can therefore conclude it was likewise vital to the project of medieval world view design. As the book of Revelation reads, when the 1,000 years are over, Satan will be released from his prison and will go out to deceive the nations in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, and to gather them for battle. In number, they are like the sand on the seashore. The wall of Gog and Magog, all that stands between Christian civilization and the hostile hordes numberless as the sands on the shore, is prominent on many of these maps, including Hereford and Ebsdorf, the Salter map and the Vercelli map and Matthew Paris's maps of the Holy Land. To play on Tertullian's familiar query of what has Athens to do with Jerusalem, I would ask, what does the Caspian Gate to do with Jerusalem? On the 13th century French Vercelli map, beside the gate we read, here is the gate that God made through Alexander's prayer, so that the Jews would not come out to lay waste to the world. Matthew Paris on a mid-13th century map writes, behind the wall of Gog and Magog, here dwell the Jews whom God enclosed through the prayer of King Alexander, and who will come forth on the eve of the day of judgment and will openly massacre all the people. They are enclosed by high and great mountains and cannot get out. The image and text in another of his maps is quite similar. Again, the text tells us, here through the prayer of King Alexander, God enclosed the Jews who will come forth on the eve of the day of judgment and will bring great destruction to the people according to God's will. It further emphasizes that the mountains are high and solid, the inaccessible and insurmountable Caspian Mountains. Similarly, Matthew tells us in the text of the previous map that the Jewish hordes of Gog and Magog are enclosed by high and great mountains and cannot get out, and further that they are far away toward the northeast. Unlike Hereford, produced when England was empty of Jews, Matthew's maps were made when there were Jews living a dozen miles from St. Albans in the Jewry of Hertford, as well as 24 miles away in the main Jewry of London. But what is the wall of Gog and Magog doing on Matthew's maps of the Holy Land at all? As he tells us on a third map, this land is far away toward the direction of Pisa. Far away from where? Far from England, surely, but also far from the sites of the map, far from the walled city of Acre, the remaining Crusader stronghold, far from Jericho and Bethlehem, and far, most importantly, from Jerusalem, as emphasized on all the Mappa Mundi from Hereford to Ebsdorf to the Salter map and on. Robert Grosseteste, Bishop of Lincoln, wrote that the Jews are a wandering people through their diaspora and are fugitives from their proper home, that is Jerusalem, and elsewhere that this people is a vagrant because of the dispersal and an exile from its own home, that is Jerusalem. On these maps, some of which stress that centrality of Jerusalem, the wall marks off a most peripheral region, a part of the marginal fringe of the world. The further a region is from the holy center of the world, runs the logic of these maps, the more horrifying its inhabitants are likely to be. This monstrous rim of the world is home to those monstrous peoples of Africa and Asia, to the hordes of Gog and Magog, but also, it should be said, to England, a land as far from the holy city of Jerusalem as is the frigid land of Bezo, and therefore a land fearful about its status in the divine order of salvation history, in need of some fearsome inhabitants to be conquered, to battle and reject, so that the English, cognizant of their status as displaced diasporic people, might find a positive role to play in the narrative. In order not to be the monsters, they had to invent some monsters to slay. The Jews, as shown by Matthew, at first seem far away, contained and incarcerated, and rendered less threatening, and yet, on the third of his maps of the Holy Land, the text inscribed behind the thick band of green mountains indicates that the hordes have already breached that wall. He writes, here remain the 9 tribes who King Alexander enclosed, Gog and Magog. From here came those people called the Tartars, of whom it is said they have shorn and cut so much of the mountains of hard rock that they managed to gain passage through and have conquered many large territories and have destroyed what is called India. It merits mention that India was the putative home of Prester John, the mighty mythical Christian king ruling over a land of unimaginable wealth with 72 kings owing him tribute. According to the Book of John Mandeville, Prester John has 13 golden crosses borne ahead of him, and to guard each there are 10,000 men at arms and more than 100,000 foot soldiers, and this number of people is without counting the main army and the troops in battle formation. This is the land that has been conquered by the Jewish, Mongol, Gog and Magog hordes, according to Matthew Paris. Though Prester John's army is beyond count, the hordes of Gog and Magog are as numerous as the sands on the seashore. While this map makes no explicit mention of Jews in the passage, the context established by the previous two and the reference to 9 tribes within and 1 outside the wall point very clearly to the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Only one of the 10 tribes, the so-called Tartars, that is the people from Tartarus, the people from hell, has thus far escaped, but was sufficient to destroy India. Matthew's first 2 maps enclose the Jews behind the wall of Gog and Magog, only to be opened in the Day of Judgment, but his third map, partaking of the apocalyptic mood of the mid-13th century, has them already ravaging the East and therefore implies that judgment is at hand, a belief that Matthew got from Joachim of Fiore, who predicted the coming of Antichrist in 1250. This is, though, also the situation as found on the post-expulsion Hereford map. The wall of Gog and Magog is present as usual with the horde behind it, but the peoples of Gog and Magog appear 3 more times outside of the wall. Just beyond the wall, an inscription states that in the time of Antichrist, the cannibalistic anthropophagi, including the Esidones, will burst forth. The Esidones appear a 2nd time with grisly imagery feasting on the dismembered corpses of their parents. Then to the east is the city of Chulisime, which according to its built to the west, the island of Terraconta, which contains, quote, the lineage of Gog and Magog, a barbarous and filthy people who eat the flesh of youths and, my apologies, miscarried fetuses. This is an accusation so vile that it manages to render the act of cannibalism even more repugnant than it ordinarily is. These references on Hereford and the related inscriptions on Matthew Paris's maps all conflate the end of days narrative of Gog and Magog with contemporary Jews, Turks, and utter xenophobic fantasy, much as the image of the golden calf conflates biblical history with contemporary Jews, Saracens, so-called, polytheist idol worshippers, and scatological paranoia. These cartographic moments need to be examined as a group. As Alessandro Scaffi writes, Mappa Mundi present an overview that includes past, present, and future. The Hereford map's image of the so-called Holy Land as a place and of the Jews as a people rooted therein but displaced in space and time presented medieval Christian viewers ample food for rumination without necessarily leading to a single clear conclusion. The Jews were forever locked in a stubborn past, prophesied into a horrifying future, and problematically, defiantly existent in the medieval present, even after the expulsion ought to have rendered them denizens of elsewhere, of other places and other times. And so I conclude. On Matthew Paris's first map of the Holy Land, just outside the walls holding back for now Gog and Magog, there is a now fragmentary inscription. The red text fades away at the point where the added flap of vellum is heavily creased, owing to having spent the better part of 7.5 centuries folded up with the flap tucked back into the codex. As reconstructed, it reads, this region in relation to Jerusalem, but the mountains are far away toward the northeast from Acre and Jerusalem. The Jews might well have been seen as part of biblical history as they appear in the worship of the golden calf on Hereford, and therefore not only intimately but permanently tied to the Holy Land. They might alternately have been seen as modern peoples of the medieval present, evil moneylenders and helpful neighbors both. They might even have been seen as central elements of the end-time narrative of the Book of Revelation, as members of the horde of Gog and Magog, or as the entirety of this bloodthirsty mass, as on Hereford and Matthew Paris's maps. They might alternately have been seen just as what they were. Children forced to wear humiliating yellow badges starting at 7 years old, women and men, families, communities of flesh and bone as good people and bad, with hearts as often full of love and compassion as of greed, lust, and hate. But instead, they came to be ciphers, encoding within them all the fears, hopes, and longings of the Christians, particularly the ruling, secular, and ecclesiastical authorities who invited them into England and then restricted their movements, humiliated, robbed, tortured, murdered, and expelled them, in order to generate through their exclusion the fantasy of a pure but constantly imperiled Christendom. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mittman. That was an incredibly informative presentation. We're always excited to hear folks challenge Dr. Woodward as far as his cartographic history is concerned. So that's a wonderful examination of that. Thank you very much. So we'll go ahead and open the floor to questions. As folks digest and sort of synthesize their thoughts, which I welcome you to input into the chat box. I wanted to, so there was one quote that you had during your presentation that really stuck out, and that was the repeated conflation of territory and religion. And I thought that really stuck out to me as sort of a succinct summary of what you were trying to describe. And I was curious if you see this repeated conflation as something that can be extended beyond the bounds of the medieval world. Whether it's into territories of other religions or into a more modern age. I'd just be curious if you could talk a little bit about that as to where does it go from here as far as that?
Well, it's a great question. So, I'm a medievalist, and, so my familiarity is much greater with medieval maps than it is with maps of the post-medieval periods. But I think what happens, I talked some about Heng's sort of redefining of the content of the notion of race as this, not a substantive content, but basically a way of sorting people hierarchically. And what I'd argue that happens as we shift from the Middle Ages into the early modern period and forward is that the prime racial categorizations shift. And so in medieval contexts, whiteness and Christianness are very, very closely aligned. For example, there are these conversion narratives where the so-called Saracen figures, so these are this sort of fantasied version of dark-skinned, primarily North African Muslims, where they convert to Christianity and either just before or just after the conversion suddenly become white, right? So whiteness and Christianity become sort of one and the same thing. And in image-making practices, color of figures, among other signals, is used to denote often the religion, though this is definitely not a universal system. There's lots of very interesting variations amongst that. Nothing in the Middle Ages is like a completely homogeneous system, and that's part of why it's great. So I think what I would argue is that religion is the primary sorting factor in these medieval maps. I think that nationality and raciality of another sort, that kind of, that more epidermal race, becomes more dominant in later mapping traditions. And we can see, for example, in the figures that appear around early modern maps, particularly once we start getting maps of the Americas, the way that peoples of the Americas are racialized in various ways against a Europa kind of figure who becomes popular at that point. Sarika Davies has a brilliant book, Renaissance Ethnography and the Invention of the Human, that really gets into how early modern maps deal with those issues. I strongly recommend that book to everybody. It's absolutely brilliant. So yeah, I think that this continues on, but I think it shifts from religion as the primary marker to other kinds of markers as the primary defining characteristic of the us that these maps are always really generating.
Thank you. William or Gina, if you guys have questions, I saw you raise your hand. Feel free to jump in. You should now have the option to hop in either via voice or text. Dr. Mittman, selfishly, I was curious if we could go back and take a look at that map of Outremer as a interested individual, as somebody who's interested in the Crusades. I thought it'd be really, like, from my understanding, Outremer is sort of the Holy Land during the Crusades, correct? And I was just hoping to take another look at that one example.
Sure, yeah. Outremer, yes, is the so-called Holy Land. I mean, I always do want to preface that, the Holy Land is actually, people use it as if it's actually a Jewish idea, but it's actually a Christian idea. That defines this region in a different way than Jews had ever defined it. Of course, Jerusalem is, the ancient sacred city of Judaism. There's no question about that. But the notion of the Holy Land itself is actually a Christian imposition onto a landscape, a foreign landscape. So this is of that region. It's very problematic to name region because all of the names of the region are loaded with ideologies, including today, the current debates about what to call this region and who should be there and who shouldn't and so on is, of course, incredibly fraught. But yeah, so this is that map. It's a little bit hard to look at. There's a second version of it as well related to this one, but there it is. It encompasses much of the same territory as the Matthew Paris maps, which are a little more sort of vivid to look at. He's an incredible figure. He was profoundly, I mean, he is a standout for the Christian Middle Ages. He's a standout as an anti-Semite who generates a lot of the most pernicious anti-Semitic tropes that still endure today. I mean, they are in his hand, in his own manuscripts. But he was also just a brilliant cartographer and artist and a very generative figure. So he's a figure about whom I have a lot of mixed feelings.
Got it. This is, yeah, it's a fascinating map. And when exactly was this one created or estimated?
Oh, this one is 13th century, if I'm recalling. It's been a while, actually, since I spent a lot of time looking at this one. I actually haven't spent a ton of time looking at it. I only came back to it when I stumbled on that weird bit in Conrad Miller's 19th century, multi-volume set about it that takes this time and space to just add in an old anti-Semitic trope that has nothing really to do with what this strange story is about. It's a very strange story. The cross of Nicodemus took me a little while to track down what was going on, but there's this purported account that he made a cross and then carried it sort of halfway across the world and flunked it there. But that has nothing to do with yes, of course, it has something to do with, but the story has no account of Jews nailing Christ to the cross. And so he's just plunked in this old, the Jews, right? It's just like tossed in to this history cartography text where ostensibly it has, I would have argued, no particular reason for being there, aside from the sort of casual assumption that, anti-Semitism is a norm that will be uncommented on. And in fact, as far as I know, I'm the first one to comment on it in this book, So it has in fact been largely uncommented on.
Yeah, and as someone who has read at least more than a little bit about the Hereford map, the fact that the false altar had been excluded, this is the first time that I had seen it or heard it explored in real detail, is really illustrative, I think, of some of the oversight in the cartographic history.
I see that Karen Pinto has asked a question in the chat. And hello, Karen. She says, thank you for an excellent thought-provoked talk. Well, I shouldn't have repeated that. But she says, I've wondered for a long time why the northern arm of the Mediterranean is identified as Tanais and not the Bosphorus. The Bosphorus is a much more significant body of water. So why sideline it as Tanais? Another way to undermine Byzantines, perhaps. It's a good question. I don't think it's actually directly tied to the Byzantines. I'd have to relook at the sources, but there's an active debate among some early medieval Christian authors about where to put that dividing line, and they bounce around a bunch of ideas, and so the Tanais kind of wins out sort of half-heartedly. Isidore of Seville has a big section on this, if I'm remembering correctly, and so it doesn't even seem like they're really that convinced that it's that valuable a border. And the flip side, using the Nile, is also, I mean, that's the dominant thing on a lot of the maps, but a bunch of early medieval Christian authors say, well, that doesn't make any sense because it goes through the middle of Egypt. And so you're saying that part of Egypt is in Africa and part of Egypt is in Asia? How does that make sense? And so these boundaries, they look so secure on the map because the map has these straight lines, especially the TO maps, but they're really not secure boundaries, which is sort of, I was hinting at that some when I was talking about the fact that like continents are not a medieval thing. So they are kind of semi-arbitrarily dividing up the landscape. It'd be interesting to think about whether it's a way of sidelining Byzantines. It at least isn't overtly discussed in any of the medieval texts I've looked at about it, but maybe worth a second look.
We also have another question from Diane in the Q&A.
Hello, Diane. I had to miss the beginning. Address this. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how these maps relate to such images as Matthew Paris's image of the wandering Jew in the Chronica Maiora. Yes, I do. So Matthew Paris's, the maps that I showed you are in, they are contained in this manuscript, or in a couple of two volumes of a manuscript of this thing called the Chronica Maiora, which is the Grand Chronicle, the Major Chronicle, which is a, sorry, I'm just trying to get back to those maps. There we go. it's like a universal chronicle. It starts at the beginning of the world and goes up to the present, and it keeps getting more and more detailed. So like as we get toward Matthew's own time period, it starts inflating greatly and there's all this huge amounts of detail. And he gives us in it a bunch of other content related to Jews, including he gives us an image of Jews wearing the yellow badges that were forced on them, originally in theory by the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, but it was only under Henry II, if I'm recalling, 1265, the Statute of Jewry, that these started actually being enforced in England, and they were badges in the shapes of the tablet of the law, the tablets of the law. So, you know, the kind of classic image of the Ten Commandments. And they were 7 inches high and of yellow felt, and all Jews had to start wearing them, I believe, at the age of 7 and up. So you picture, you know, a little 7-year-old child being forced to wear 7-inch high or 6-inch high yellow felt badge, which of course immediately recalls the yellow badges forced upon Jews by Nazis. So he gives us that image, and he also gives us, yes, an image of the wandering Jew, who is this figure, and he gives an account of where he learned this story, which he says he got from a couple Armenians who were visiting St. Albans, who in fact had met the wandering Jew, who is this figure who is mean to Christ, and who Christ then curses to walk the earth forever. And so he becomes a kind of embodiment, actually, of one of the phenomena that I think is really important to these maps, which is to say that Jews are not allowed to move forward in time in Christian mythology. Jews are always forever people of the past. And this has to do with, you know, the framing of the so-called Old Testament, right? A lot of modern people use that term as if Jewish scripture is the Old Testament. No, no, no. The Old Testament is a Christian appropriation of Jewish scripture reframed as something past, outdated, superseded by the New Testament, right? Jews, it's just the Testament, it's the scripture, right? And so the wandering Jew is a figure that embodies this inability of Jews to move forward. He's a literal single man who has been the same person all throughout history, existing, you know, for 1,000 years, for 1,300 years, whatever time period it's being represented. So by the time Matthew Paris is giving us an image of him, which may be the earliest image of the wandering Jew that survives from anywhere, actually, in his Chronica Maiora, he's saying this single individual Jew has been a fixed point in time, unchanging, unchangeable, and he becomes a kind of metonym for Jewishness entirely, which is figured the same way, as fixed in the past, unchanging, unable to change. So Christians are people of the modern world, and Jews are inherently this figure of the past. So yes, I think that that image is definitely tied to it. I haven't actually written about it yet. I'm thinking about writing about it. I'd add a little piece on it, but I don't know. I haven't decided yet.
Any other questions or comments for Dr. Mittman? Thank you, Karen and Diane. I have one just other comment that was actually, it's pretty random, because I was looking at a map that was published of London by John Bartholomew and Sons in 1936, and I recognized Gog and Magog are now, or at least in the earliest 20th century, were portrayed as protectors of London. And so I'm curious, do you know anything about the relationship between the historical development and that identity?
So Lorraine Stock has done work on this, as I recall. So Gog and Magog have a bunch of different kind of mythological presences. So actually in the Chronica Maiora, Matthew Paris tells us that when people first came to England, they first had to clear it of the giants who occupied the territory. And the biggest of those giants, he tells us, was called Gagamagog. So it's like this one individual, which is this fused together hybrid of this, you know, sort of whole monstrous group of people that then become this one thing. And there's actually some locations in Britain that are named for him. Outside of Cambridge, what is now a golf course, is the Gagamagog Hills. So there's a way that Gog and Magog are brought to England and kind of localized in a strange way. But then what happens, I think, in terms of their appearance as protectors, the earliest example of this, I think, is at the Guildhall in London. There were actually 2 large statues of Gog and Magog, since destroyed. I think they burned in fire or something. But this partakes, I believe, of a kind of common thing that happens, particularly in the later Middle Ages, where monstrous figures are used for their fearsomeness, for their power, as figures of protectors. Often you see them holding up coats of arms, escutcheons. So among the most common figures used for that are wild men, who are, these sort of Bigfoot-like people, these usually slightly gigantic, hair-covered, club-wielding giants who are fearsome and powerful. But you also see griffins, lions, dragons serving this function. And so while they're serving as protectors, it is only because of the fearsomeness of them that allows them to do that. Now, you want the really weird bit?
Of course.
Let me see if we can get a quick look here. Okay, so among images that have not attracted as much attention as they should, this is the Nubian gate on the Ebsdorf map. And it tells us that the Nubians are the Christianissime gens, the most Christian of people. And it's a common trope in medieval European sources that there's this group of incredibly devout African Christians. Guarding the gate to the Nubians are these two naked male figures. They are both bearded and wearing these curious broad-brimmed, high conical pointed hats. Those hats are called Judenhut. They're also called Pilium cornutum. They are the hats that were worn by Jews in the period as part of the clothing mandated as part of that Fourth Lateran Council regulation I was talking about that said Jews needed to wear distinctive clothing. There's some debate about whether Jews were already wearing hats kind of like that, and then it became non-optional to wear this self-identifying clothing. But anyway, those are Jewish hats, and these figures with the beards, right? These are standard representations of Jews, except they are giant and naked and holding spears and shields. And they're guarding the Christianissime gens, the most Christian people back there. And so what we have is a very strange image where what I think is going on is that the Jews are functioning here like wild men do in those contexts I was describing, which is to say, like lions and dragons do, which is to say, they were seen as fearsome, deadly, terrifying. And so there's a kind of ambiguity to this image. On the one hand, you're like, oh, well, wow, they're great, strong protectors. On the other hand, they're typed with monsters in this role, because that's the kind of roles that we get for guardian figures, things like Gog and Magog. Now, Gog and Magog is interesting because in a lot of the sources, Gog and Magog is Jewish, or are Jewish. They are Jewish, right? And so they are already monsterized Jews. And so it's kind of tempting to be like, look, this is a positive image of Jews as these great, powerful guards. But in fact, they're being presented in essence, I would argue, as monstrous guards. Why they're guarding the most Christian people, I don't know, but there they are.
Fascinating. There is certainly a lot to dive into whenever you really start looking at these medieval maps.
Yes.
Looks like we've got another question from Benjamin in the Q&A.
Okay, in your talk, you mentioned that Jews worshiping the golden calf were depicted as worshiping Mahun. Was it common to conflate Judaism and Islam on maps or in other medieval texts? Yes, absolutely. This conflation is incredibly common. And in fact, when medieval Christians first confront Muslims in any kind of serious way, they mistake them for Jews. They actually think that they are a group of heretical Jews. And they think this not really irrationally. It's not crazy to think this, because what they encounter is a group of people who follow dietary laws that are basically kosher laws. Halal laws and kosher laws come from the same passages, more or less, that have a bunch of texts that seem in common, have a bunch of the same kind of stories, and also, very interestingly, are more or less aniconic. That is to say, don't make representational images, or very rarely or in various contexts, but primarily do not make religious representational images, neither Jews nor Muslims. And so that's their first take on them. And eventually they start to learn more about Muslims and realize they're a separate group, but they keep conflating them together as the kind of closest form of otherness. So there's, all kinds of othered groups that have nothing to do with Christians in particular, strange dog-headed people on the other side of the world. That's one thing, but they know about the closeness of Islam and Judaism to Christianity. And this is a source that I think causes some anxiety. And so, yes, they're very frequently conflated, such that For example, when I was quoting some of those texts about Gog and Magog breaking out, sometimes they're referred to as the Tartars. Tartars, that's another one of these racist prejudicial terms. Again, it comes from the people from hell, from Tartarus. But those are the Mongols. And the Mongols were a very complicated civilization with many different religious groups, but they had a kind of Muslim orientation, at least in certain times. But in the Christian texts, those Mongols, those Tartars, are also Jews, right? And so, yes, these groups are constantly being tied together and overlapped, such that we have Jews who don't make or worship images, worshiping the Muslim idol, which is an idol for Muslims who don't make or worship images, right? And so I would further argue that the kind of obsession that we get in Christian texts about Muslim and Jewish idol worship, which ostensibly should make no sense, right? Because it is Christians who are actually setting up lots and lots of images. Now, theologians argue they are not worshiping those images. They are venerating those images. The Byzantines articulate these distinctions much more richly and thoroughly than Latin Christians do. But if we look at Latin Christian image making and image using practices, we see tons of stuff that seems pretty indistinguishable from image worship, carrying images into battle before armies, scraping pieces of images off to make miraculous or medicinal cures, images doing things like weeping or sweating oils that are then collected and used in healing rituals. These are practices that look a whole lot like violations of the second commandment. You'll make no images of anything in the heavens above or on the earth or in the waters beneath the earth, for I'm a jealous God. That's a pretty unambiguous thing. Well, Jews and Muslims are not making those images. Christians are making those images. So Christian anxiety about those image making practices is pushed outward to these closer others, to Jews and Muslims, to say, oh, no, they worship images. They make idols. They worship idols. We don't. We just have all these, we just have our churches completely filled, floor to ceiling, nave to apse with images, right? But we don't worship idols. Those people who have no such images worship idols. So it's a kind of externalization of Christian anxiety about Christian practices and potential violations of Second Commandment, prescriptions, which is part of, I think, the reason that Jews and Muslims become kind of fused together in the Christian imaginary. So yes, it is very, very common for these conflations to occur, definitely. Thank you for that question.
That us versus them that you had mentioned earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Diane and Karen also had a few more questions in the Q&A.
Diane asks, what is the triangular shape above the two naked Jews? It looks oddly like a purse, or is it a belt? Are we talking are we talking about this thing?
Yes.
I think what it is it's hard to see. And so the Ebsdorf map I mentioned was bombed in the Allied bombing of Hanover. It had actually, ironically, been brought to Hanover for safekeeping. They should have left it in Ebsdorf. But before it was bombed, before it was moved there, photographs were taken of it, but these were like an early photographic process. And then all the photographs were then hand painted on top of the photographs. And so that's what we're looking at here, is this weird hand painted early photographic copy of this map. And so we got to take, while the content seems like it was reproduced fairly faithfully, we've got to take the style of it with a bit of a grain of salt, if that makes sense. But what I think what we're seeing there on that red sort of triangular lozenge shape, if you look at the city just above it, which is the city of Nubia, you see those roof lines. I think it's another roof. So there's like a little round turret in front of the larger square tower, and I think that's what that is on that.
Medieval three-dimensional depth perception.
Yes. I mean, medieval art is willfully abstracted, right? So a lot of people think, medieval people like couldn't make good art, right? They couldn't make things look naturalistic. But naturalism is a tool that serves certain ends, and the Middle Ages tended to favor abstraction, though there are naturalistic moments within it, definitely. But I do think it's kind of odd that in the postmodern world, like after we made it through modernism and abstraction, after we had Picasso, it seems weird to me that people think that abstraction is the like naiver form of art instead of naturalism, right? We think that modern art is more sophisticated than the stuff that came before it, but then decide that the same kind of image choices, when they happened before that, were naive and incompetent, you know? Where in fact, it's a very willful choice. One point perspective is actually a very simple tool, and when people want it, they develop it pretty readily. So yeah, it's part of the sort of wonderful abstraction that is part of medieval image making practices. And Karen Pinto asks, have you thought of comparing with Islamic depictions of Gog and Magog? Yes, and I saw a map that has them on it. It's crazy. Actually, I think you might have sent it to me. Really cool image. Yes, I at some point want to look at Jewish maps and Islamic maps and Christian maps kind of all together by looking at some of the same details, like looking at Gog and Magog to see if we can find those across all three map types to see how they're being configured from different perspectives. I mean, this project that I'm working on, these are a couple of pieces out of a book that I'm desperately trying to finish, but it is very explicitly a book about Christian ideas and Christian maps, even though Jews are very much at the heart of it, but it's about these mythologized Jews, not more than it is about actual Jews who made Jewish maps, which do exist. And it's part of the stuff I was trying to get at in the historiographical section, is there are lots and lots, there are tons of Islamic maps, tons, hundreds, and there are Jewish maps from the period as well. And you know, they almost never appear in any of these accounts of European maps or medieval maps. Is this kind of bias in the sources or bias in the scholarship? But my project is really still about those Christian maps, but I'm trying to be overt and explicit about that, not concealing the subject, but making that subject very much at the forefront of what I'm doing, trying to show how the medieval maps, but also the modern history of cartography has framed these discussions such that we are pushed into a kind of Christian position without even realizing often that's happened.
Any other questions or comments for Dr. Mittman? Well, thank you again for sharing your tremendous and groundbreaking research. It really has been fascinating to sort of be at the cutting edge of really pushing as to what the bounds of understanding the history of cartography means. And it's been a pleasure and an honor to be a part of that. So thank you again for sharing with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you, all of those of you out there in the audience who I wish I could see in person. And thank you all so much for hosting me. It was a real pleasure. I enjoyed it very much.
Absolutely. Well, till next time, take care and thanks again.
Okay.